In the summer of 1318, a stranger walked up to a royal palace in Oxford and announced that the King of England was a fraud. The real king, he said, had been missing for over 30 years. And he could prove it because the real king was standing right there at the gate, and the real king was missing an ear. What happened next involves a derisive royal greeting, a humiliated queen, a trial for sedition, and a cat that was, according to its owner's own confession, the devil himself. Almost none of it survives in official court records, and nearly everything we know comes from chroniclers who couldn't agree on his name, his origins, or where he met his end. On one thing they agreed. For a few strange weeks, a one-eared clerk made the most powerful man in England look like an imposter in his own kingdom. It's important to understand who Edward II was and how things had been going in England, because under normal circumstances this event may not have made the history books at all. Edward II had been on the throne for 11 years, and nearly all of them had gone badly, with the crown being substantially weakened more and more throughout his reign. His father, Edward I, had been the most feared warrior king in Europe, the man who had hammered the Scots and the Welsh into submission. His son was, to put it simply, not cut from the same cloth as his powerful and feared father. He'd spent his early reign showering favors, and perhaps a good deal of love, on Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight. This relationship with the king so enraged the barons of the realm that they seized Gaveston and cut him down on a hillside in 1312. Then came Bannockburn. In June 1314, Edward marched the largest English army of a generation into Scotland and watched Robert the Bruce dismantle it in 2 days. The king himself fled the field, and it was effectively the worst military humiliation England had suffered in living memory. And just when it seemed like it couldn't get any worse, it started raining, and it just didn't stop. The summers of 1315 through 1317 brought catastrophic harvest failures across northern Europe, and England starved through what historians now call the Great Famine. Grain prices spiked, livestock perished, and chroniclers wrote of people reduced to eating things no one should have to eat. In the understanding of the time, the ceaseless rains weren't some sort of meteorological phenomenon that could be explained by science. It was a sign that Edward's reign wasn't righteous, that he was failing in his duties as the ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Christendom. Through all of it, the king feuded with his most powerful baron, his cousin Thomas of Lancaster, and by 1318, the two were circling each other in an armed standoff. So that's the England John Deidris walked into. A hungry, beaten, resentful country whose king was both perceived as weak and didn't look a thing like a king should look. And that was exactly the point John Deidris intended to make when he showed up on the scene. A young clerk appeared one day at Beaumont Palace just outside Oxford's North Gate. The Lanercost Chronicle pins his arrival near the feast of the Nativity of John the Baptist, late in June. The palace had history, and Richard the Lionheart had been born there, and King John after him. Though its royal days were nearly over at that time, as Edward handed it to the Carmelite friars that same year, it would play this one last role in royal history. The man at the gate is recorded under several names: John Deidris, John Deidris, John of Powderham, and in the one surviving government record, simply John of Exeter. The chronicles describe him as a literate clerk, said to be tall and good-looking, with a notable resemblance to the king himself. He was also, unmistakably, missing an ear, which will be a key part of his claim that he was the true King Edward. He claimed the royal palace as his own property, and then he claimed the kingdom itself. His narrative went like this. He was the true son of Edward I, born heir to the English throne. As an infant, he'd been left in the care of a nurse in a royal courtyard, where a deranged sow attacked him and chewed off his ear. The nurse, terrified of what the king would do to her, made a desperate choice. She found a peasant's newborn son, swapped the babies, and handed the royal child away to be raised in poverty. The peasant's boy grew up in silk and gold and was crowned in Westminster Abbey in 1308, and the real prince grew up with nothing. Well, nothing except the knowledge of who he actually was, passed down to him by his adoptive parents. Now the man who had been raised in poverty had come back, and he wanted the throne that was rightfully his. He even offered terms: single combat with Edward II, man against man, and God could decide which of them was the rightful king of England. Daedrus presumably knew that King Edward wasn't inclined to combat whatsoever, which furthered the humiliation of the challenge. This was still a time when kings of England were expected to be of exceptional personal strength and martial prowess, and Edward, simply put, wasn't. According to the Lanercost Chronicle, Daedrus continued to stand at Beaumont and declared openly that the man on the throne wasn't of royal blood at all and had no right to the realm. This was proclaimed at a royal palace in a university town, and the rumor spread across England with remarkable speed. The narrative was absurd, and it landed anyway, because it explained something that had been bothering people for years. Edward II didn't behave the way a medieval king was supposed to behave. The chronicles are full of bewildered accounts of his hobbies. He dug ditches, thatched roofs, rowed boats, swam with crowds of common folk, and reportedly liked eating dinner with carpenters. To a modern viewer, that sounds almost charming, a suggestion that the king was a man of the people. To the 14th century mind, it was so deeply wrong that it violated the natural order that had been set for the world. Rank was the organizing principle of the entire world, and a king who preferred hedging and ditching to jousting and combat looked like a walking contradiction of that natural order. In 1315, a man named Robert Le Messager was arrested for grumbling that England had lost Bannockburn because its king wasted his time on the activities of common folk. People had been whispering for years that Edward must be a changeling, that the royal bloodline had somewhere been switched out. They simply couldn't understand that the son of a man known as the Hammer of the Scots could be so thoroughly hammered by the Scots, and this is where the whispers really began. 2 years before the Oxford affair, another man had already been hauled into court for calling the king a changeling outright. Daedrus didn't invent that rumor, he just gave it a face that people could get behind. The Lanercost chronicler makes the connection explicitly. Some people lent the pretender their belief all the more readily, because Edward resembled his father in none of his virtues. The king enjoyed activities that peasants enjoyed, and in the style of the time, that meant that he likely inherited those proclivities from his real father. If Edward was secretly a peasant's son, then suddenly everything made sense. He enjoyed digging ditches because that's what peasants do with their days. The loss at Bannockburn also made sense because peasants weren't fit to lead troops, but to be commanded. Edward's cowardly display at the battle also, quote-unquote, proved that he may actually be of peasant stock. It didn't matter that the real Edward had been born at Carnarvon Castle in April 1284, in front of an entire royal household, a birth about as hard to fake as a coronation. Royal births were witnessed and recorded, and potential heirs to the throne were watched extremely closely at all times. The idea that the royal heir was ever left alone to the care of one woman, with no one else aware of his location, simply wasn't something that happened. If a pig had actually attacked the young king and bit off his ear, a swap with a peasant would have required the plotting of numerous different people. The story of the swap had no basis in any reality anyone could locate, but logic has never been much of a match for a narrative that people want to believe. Word of the pretender soon reached Edward himself, who was at Northampton that summer, locked in delicate negotiations with Lancaster's faction. Daedrus was arrested and brought before him, and what happened next tells you a great deal about Edward II. Standing face to face with a man publicly claiming his crown and his very identity, the king laughed. The Lanercost chronicler records that Edward greeted the prisoner mockingly as his long-lost brother. He seems to have found the whole affair tremendously funny, and one contemporary account says he proposed keeping Daedrus as his court jester. He would spend the rest of his life as a living joke about the worst thing anyone had ever said about him. The queen, for her part, wasn't laughing and didn't care for the way her weak husband was handling the situation. Isabella of France was the daughter of two sovereigns, raised at the most status-obsessed court in Europe, and she'd spent a decade watching her husband embarrass the crown. The author of the Vita Eduardi Secundi, an unusually candid contemporary chronicle written by someone close to the royal administration, commented further. It says the affair's notoriety spread through the whole country and annoyed the queen beyond words, to the point that she became obsessed with the claim. She'd given birth to her third child, a daughter named Eleanor, at Woodstock on the 18th of June, only a few days before the pretender made his stand at Beaumont. While she recovered, England was openly entertaining the idea that she'd married a peasant's son, and her children were of peasant stock. Some modern historians have wondered whether the humiliation of 1318 planted something in Isabella that bore fruit 9 years later, when she led the rebellion that ended her husband's reign. Others point out, fairly, that there's no evidence she believed a word of it, only that it wounded her reputation. The fact that someone had directly insulted the royal grace of her offspring was, to put it mildly, not something Isabella was okay with. And to give some additional context here, while Edward is remembered as an incompetent and weak ruler, Isabella is remembered as the she-wolf of France, a well-deserved reputation. The powerful barons of the realm weren't laughing either, especially when they heard of the plan to make Daedrus a court jester. With the Lancaster negotiations balanced on a knife's edge, a pretender claiming royal blood was a loose thread in a kingdom already fraying, and somebody was going to pull it. The jester plan was overruled, reportedly at the Queen's and the magnates' insistence, and John Daedrus went to trial for sedition. Facing the king's court, the man who would be king fell apart. Daedrus confessed that the whole story was an invention, and that his real father, according to the chronicles, was an Exeter tanner. His explanation for why he'd done it was, if anything, stranger than the original claim. He'd been led astray, he said, by his pet cat, which was no cat at all but the devil in disguise. The creature had tempted him with the throne of England, and its promises, he insisted, had always come true before. Unfortunately, the specific claims this cat had allegedly previously made have been lost to history. Fabricating a royal claim was sedition, and taking career advice from a satanic cat added consorting with the devil to the charge sheet. In the summer of 1318, either was enough. The sentence was carried out in stages. He was reportedly drawn behind horses, hanged on the gallows, and his body burned afterward. The flames were perhaps reserved for the diabolical part of his confession, and by several accounts, the unfortunate cat was hanged right alongside him. Historians now universally agree that the cat was, in all likelihood, simply an ordinary pet, and not the physical manifestation of the Dark Lord himself. Though I'm sure I'm not the only one who has encountered an unusually sinister cat in my day, so you be the judge. Accounts even differ on where this whole ordeal happened, and that question opens up more questions about the historicity of this entire event. Some say Oxford, where his strange campaign began, though the administrative trail points to Northampton in late July. And that trail is a short one. The one clear record the case left behind in official records is an order concerning the delivery of John of Exeter from the jail at Northampton. It notes that he was imprisoned for claiming to be the king's brother, rather than being the king himself, an entry that survives in the patent rolls of the period. That clerical scrap of evidence is, effectively, the only piece of the story that survives outside the chronicles. And if you're a longtime viewer of my medieval mysteries videos, or if you're just a medieval history fan, you know that chroniclers were often more concerned with a good narrative than accuracy. That brings us to the question of the truth of what happened, which cuts in two directions. First, the claim itself. No serious historian, medieval or modern, has ever treated Daedrus's story as true. The chroniclers who recorded it considered him deluded, demonic, or both, and the modern consensus is that he was mentally unwell. The idea that you would attempt to escape a sedition charge by claiming to have an evil familiar in the form of a cat lends credence to this modern idea. In essence, it's the modern equivalent to confessing to a much more serious crime in an effort to get out of another significant charge. Notably, even the people who despised Edward II never took up the pretender's cause. The Lanercost chronicler admits some foolish commoners adhered to him, but no baron backed him and no faction used him. In an era when pretenders could raise armies, John Daedrus raised only eyebrows from the powerful men who were seeking to use anything to destroy Edward. This was an era where people of uncertain origin could be championed by powerful factions, not because they believed the claim, but because it was useful. But there's a specific reason this claim likely never gained any traction whatsoever, even in those uncertain times. His claim required the impossible, a swapped heir hidden for 3 decades with not one shred of real evidence beyond the fact that Edward wasn't a strong ruler. The idea that rulers were, in essence, a roll of the dice wasn't an unfamiliar concept to the barons who could have supported him. Further, the most powerful faction at this point in medieval England was led by the king's cousin. The idea that Edward's cousin would potentially champion someone who tossed the entire royal lineage into question was simply absurd. But there's also the question about the veracity of the entire event itself, which is murkier than most retellings admit. Strip away the chronicles and almost nothing remains to verify what actually happened. The jail order proves a man was imprisoned at Northampton in 1318 for claiming royal kinship, and that's roughly where the documentary trail ends. It's notable that the surviving order didn't indicate that he was pretending to be the king himself, only that he was the king's brother. It's possible that the chronicles added the more lurid parts of the tale based on rumors that grew in the telling. The sow, the single combat challenge, the greeting from the king, the jester offer, the satanic cat, all of it comes from chroniclers writing at varying distances from events. What's beyond doubt is what the episode revealed. A clerk with one ear held up a mirror to the English monarchy, and the kingdom flinched at what it saw. Whether John claimed to be the king himself, talked into it by a cat, or whether he simply claimed to be the king's brother, will likely never be known for certain. 9 years later, in January 1327, Edward II was deposed in favor of his own teenage son in a revolution led by his wife, Isabella of France. He became the first English king since the conquest to be stripped of his throne. The men who pulled him down didn't need a story about a deranged sow ripping off the true king's ear and a secretive nursemaid. By then, they'd settled on a simpler claim, that whoever Edward was by birth, he had never truly been fit to sit on the throne of England. On Christmas Day, 1069, William the Conqueror held court in a city of cinders. York had been fought over twice that year, and the second battle had left it a burned-out shell, with the minster gutted along with almost everything else. And yet William reportedly had his crown and royal regalia brought up from the south, so he could wear them there, in the wreckage. The performance had a point. He was telling the north of England that he was its king, whether it wanted him or not. But that ceremony was also a hinge between two campaigns, and behind him lay a year of rebellion that had nearly cost him his new kingdom. Ahead of him lay the order he was about to give, that his soldiers should fan out across Yorkshire and destroy everything a human being needs to survive a winter. That meant the food, the seeds, the plows, the cattle, and often the entire villages themselves. A chronicler born just a few years after these events claimed that more than 100,000 people perished of hunger in the months that followed. Even writers who admired William treated it as the darkest mark on his record. We remember it as the harrying of the North, and it has a fair claim to being the cruelest thing any king of England has ever done to his own subjects. England in 1066 was one united kingdom mostly on paper, a newly conquered territory still being brought into the Norman fold. The North, meaning roughly Yorkshire, Durham, and Northumberland, was a different world from the South. Generations of Viking settlement had produced an Anglo-Scandinavian society with its own customs and dialect, and an aristocracy south of the Tees that was partly Danish in origin. The roads were so poor that travelers between York and the south often found it easier to go by ship, and the region had a long habit and history of something between high autonomy and full self-rule. Back in 962, King Edgar had effectively traded legal autonomy to the northern earls for their loyalty. This meant the kings who followed governed beyond the Humber, more in theory than in practice, with only loose allegiances in the north. After Hastings, English resistance gathered around Edgar Atheling, the teenage grandson of Edmund Ironside, and the last royal claimant of the House of Wessex. He submitted to William at Berkhamsted in December 1066, along with most of the surviving English leadership, but the submission didn't hold. Of all the men who knelt to William that winter, the Archbishop of York was about the only one who stayed loyal. William's first instinct was to rule the north through proxies, and the results were almost comically bad. He made a Northumbrian named Copsey the Earl of the area in 1067, with hopes that putting a local in charge would help calm dissent in the region. Copsey lasted all of 5 weeks before a rival named Osolf cut him down. Osolf, for his part, seized the earldom and attempted to rule the region on behalf of William, but he perished within the year himself. Then his cousin Gospatric simply bought the title from William, held it briefly, and joined Edgar Atheling's rebellion in 1068. 2 earls slain, and a third turned traitor, all in about 18 months, and with that, William marched north that summer, and the opposition melted away before him. Edgar and his allies fled to the court of Malcolm III, King of Scots, and waited for an opportunity to strike the Norman. So William changed tactics and appointed one of his own, a knight named Robert de Comines, as Earl of Northumbria. Robert headed north with somewhere between 500 and 900 men, depending on which source you read. Athelwine, the English Bishop of Durham, warned him that a rebel army was gathering and that he was riding into a trap. Robert ignored him and quartered his men in Durham anyway, where they reportedly treated the town like enemy territory. Before dawn on the 28th of January, 1069, the Northumbrians broke through the gates and went through the town end to end, eliminating Robert's men in the streets and houses. The Earl himself took refuge in the bishop's residence, so the rebels simply burned it down over his head. Robert had been, in title, the Earl of Northumbria for as little as a few months, and he never effectively ruled the area. Out of the entire Norman force, the sources say only 1 or 2 survivors escaped to carry the news south. From there, the rebellion spread immediately, and the rebels turned on York, where they eliminated the guardian of the new castle along with many of his men, and put the garrison under siege. William came north fast, caught the besiegers outside the castle, and broke them. He built a second castle across the river, left trusted men in charge, and went south again, presumably hoping the matter was settled. Edgar Atheling had been busy. He'd appealed to Sweyn II of Denmark, a nephew of King Canute with his own respectable claim to the English throne. In the late summer of 1069, Sweyn answered, and a Danish fleet of somewhere between 240 and 300 ships arrived. It was commanded by the king's brother and two of his sons, worked its way up the east coast, raiding as it went, and turned into the Humber estuary. There it joined Edgar, Gospatric, and the other Northumbrian leaders, and together they marched on York. What followed was a disaster of the Normans' own making. The garrison, trying to clear ground around the two castles before the assault, set fire to the nearby houses. The fire escaped them, tore through the city for days, and consumed most of it, including the minster. When the Danes and the English stormed York in September, the castles fell anyway. The garrison was effectively wiped out, with some accounts putting the Norman dead in the thousands, with numerous high nobles worth ransoming captured. It was the worst defeat William ever suffered on English soil, and for a few weeks his hold on the kingdom looked shakier than at any point since Hastings. Risings flared up as far away as Devon, Shropshire, and Staffordshire, and the whole Norman conquest was wobbling. William responded by dealing with the Midlands first, before he then marched on York. At the crossing of the River Aire, his army was reportedly held up for 3 weeks by broken bridges and hostile forces on the far bank. By the time he reached the city, the rebel army had scattered rather than face him. Edgar had slipped back over the border to Scotland, and the Danes had withdrawn to their ships in the Humber. And here William did something coldly practical. He sent envoys to the Danish commander and cut a deal. According to the Worcester Chronicle, he secretly paid the Danes a large sum and gave them leave to forage along the coast through the winter. The one condition was that they sail home in the spring without a fight, and as was tradition, the Danes accepted the deal. That left only the people of the north, and for them there would be no negotiated settlement to their rebellion. What William did to the north that winter wasn't a series of battles or even a campaign in the normal sense of the word. The rebels wouldn't meet him in the field, so he set out to destroy the thing that kept them in the field, the countryside itself. His army laid waste to the land along his line of march from the Aire, and after that Christmas court in the ruins, he split his forces into smaller detachments. From there, he sent them out across Yorkshire with instructions that amounted to open conflict with anything that could sustain life. From the Humber to the Tees, the soldiers burned villages and slew the inhabitants who didn't flee. They torched grain stores and barns, smashed plows and farm tools, and slaughtered livestock where it stood. The detail that historians keep coming back to is the seed, because destroying it meant the survivors couldn't plant in spring. Whatever the first sweep of soldiers missed, hunger was meant to finish. It was siege warfare without a castle, as if the whole of Yorkshire had been declared a single fortress to be starved into surrender. Orderic Vitalis, the chronicler who gives us the fullest account, wrote that William made no attempt to restrain his fury and punish the innocent alongside the guilty. The land emptied, and refugees from the harrying turn up in the records as far south as Worcestershire. The Chronicle of Evesham Abbey describes starving people arriving at the abbey gates driven out of their northern homelands. Others fled north into lowland Scotland, many of whom ended up settling there permanently. The monks of Durham, with their bishop, took the body of St. Cuthbert, their most precious relic, and carried it out to the holy island of Lindisfarne for safekeeping. They were retracing the road their predecessors had walked 2 centuries earlier when they fled the Vikings. The North's holiest community was running from a Christian king, a fact that caused significant outrage across Western Europe. William, meanwhile, wasn't finished, and he intended to strike his enemies when they least expected it. In the depths of that winter, he took his army west across the Pennines, through terrain his own soldiers considered impassable in the season, to crush a rising at Chester. Orderic says some of his hired soldiers from Anjou, Brittany, and Maine begged to be released from service rather than attempt the crossing. He pressed on with the men who'd follow him, subdued Chester and Stafford, and devastated parts of Cheshire, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, and Shropshire on the way. Then came the spring, and the hunger, and the accounts that are hard to read even at 9.5 centuries distance. Simon of Durham, writing in the early 12th century, recorded that the famine grew so severe that people ate horses, dogs, and cats, amongst other even less desirable meals. He describes corpses rotting in houses and along roads, because no one was left with the strength to bury them. He claims the land between York and Durham lay uncultivated for 9 years afterwards, its empty villages the haunt of wild beasts and robbers. The Worcester Chronicle says William spent the entire winter laying waste to the country, slaying the inhabitants, and inflicting every kind of evil without pause. The famous number of victims, often cited, comes from Orderic Vitalis, and the man himself is worth a moment so we can understand the context further. He was born in Shropshire in 1075, a few years after the harrying, to an English mother and a French father, and was sent at the age of 10 to a monastery in Normandy. He was a loyal subject of the Norman world, and his account praised William generously elsewhere. Yet on this subject, the harrying of the North, he refused any praise whatsoever. He wrote that more than 100,000 people perished of starvation, and stated flatly that God would punish the man who ordered it. The surprise here wasn't entirely that Orderic said it. It was the blunt confidence that God's punishment was coming for William for what he had done. We don't have to take the chronicler's word for it, because in 1086, William ordered the great survey of England we know as the Domesday Book. Domesday went village by village through Yorkshire. What its commissioners wrote over and over, estate after estate, was a single bleak Latin formula, meaning the land was waste. Modern analyses of the Yorkshire returns suggest 60% of holdings were wholly or partly wasteland 16 years after the harrying. It was found that 2/3 of villages contained manors that had been abandoned by their lords, and land values had collapsed. One great lord's Yorkshire estates, worth £260 in 1066, were valued at about £10 in 1086. The lands of one magnate fell from more than £550 to barely 90. It's important to remember that the value of these estates were tied to how many people could work the land and make it productive. The collapse in monetary value of the estate indirectly shows that a massive population drop must have accompanied it even decades later. By some calculations, only a quarter of the population and plow teams remained, and the bleakest readings of the evidence suggest most of the missing had either perished or never come back. Archaeology adds its own testimony, with hordes of coins buried around 1069 and never reclaimed. Notably, some villages across Yorkshire and Durham laid out afterwards are in suspiciously regular plans, as if they'd been built to a plan, rather than organically over generations. And yet, despite all of that, the harrying of the North is now one of the liveliest arguments in medieval English history, with some significantly downplaying the scale of the event. The skeptical case runs like this, and honestly, I'm presenting the best version of it here, even if I personally don't believe it. William was in the North for perhaps 3 months with an army of a few thousand men in midwinter. It's fair to ask whether that force could physically destroy thousands of square miles of countryside in the time available. The Danes were foraging along the coast that same winter, with William's blessing, and Scottish armies under Malcolm raided deep into the region soon afterwards. Under this theory, the Domesday Book's portrait of extreme desolation may bundle together damage from several hands. Now here's where I consider this argument extremely weak. None of the other parties would have had their hands in the North but for William's harsh rule. Had he not already made a mess of the North, the other events wouldn't have happened. I feel like the causation here would have been foreseeable for William, so I don't think it's too remote to lay the blame at his feet for the actions of the Danes especially. In that instance, he specifically gave them the right to essentially raid the land as one of the terms for his settlement with them. Some scholars have even argued that waste or wasteland in the Doomsday Book was partly an accounting label, covering land the commissioners couldn't assess. Orderic's 100,000 also deserves scrutiny, since England's whole population was only around 2 million. It's important to remember that round numbers in medieval chronicles often mean a very great many rather than a count. It is, in essence, not a real number, but the equivalent to saying something like a zillion, where everyone knows it means a lot, but everyone also knows that's not a real number. The other side answers that every chronicle tradition we have, Norman, English, and Northern alike, agrees this event was exceptional. The writers of the time didn't treat the harrying of the North as being within the normal rules of pacifying civil strife. Some modern historians see what William did as a callback to a Roman style of conflict, where the Romans would leave ruins and call it peace. And I do have to agree with that assessment, since some of the accounts of the North after sound more like Carthage, after it was razed in 146 BC, than any regular medieval campaign. There's also the fact that what William did to his nominal subjects was just entirely outside the realm of how a good Christian king was supposed to behave. A king was, in the understanding of the time, the highest temporal authority within his realm, and was expected to be a patriarchal figure to his subjects. He was expected to be a figure of moral excellence, and collective punishments of Christian subjects was considered immoral behavior. Orderic, for his part, gave history its verdict in advance, and has William lament the worst sin of his life. Writing decades later, he composed a deathbed speech for William, in which the old king confesses that he fell on the English of the North like a savage lion. In this speech, he apologizes for ordering their homes and crops burnt and their herds slaughtered, and so became the agent by which countless innocents starved. Almost no historian believes William actually said it, but Orderic put the words in the king's mouth anyway, because he needed his otherwise glowing Norman king to be heroic. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to leave a comment saying what you've learned from this video, or what you like to do while you watch or listen. On April 13th, 1314, a proclamation rang out through the streets of London in the king's name. England was 10 weeks away from one of the worst military disasters in its history at Bannockburn, and the crown had every reason to be thinking about other things. Yet this decree said nothing about what was to come. It described a menace loose in the fields around the city, something so loud and so disruptive that anyone caught near it now faced prison. The menace was a ball that Englishmen had started kicking around with feet for entertainment. The man who actually issued the order was Nicholas de Farndone, the mayor of London, acting on behalf of King Edward II. The text was written in Norman French, the administrative language of England's ruling class. A copy was entered into one of the city's books of record, the Liber Memorandorum, where it survives to this day in the City of London's archives. The complaint it laid out was simple. There was a great uproar in the city, it said, caused by crowds hustling over large footballs in the public fields, and from this chaos, many evils might arise. So the mayor commanded, in the king's name, that the game no longer be played within the city, and anyone who ignored the order faced imprisonment. Farndone couldn't have known what he was starting. His order is widely considered the first official ban on football anywhere in England, and one of the earliest surviving official references to the game at all. The French text refers to large balls kicked by the foot, which is about as close to a birth certificate as the word football has. Generations of kings and town councils would spend the next 3.5 centuries trying to do exactly what Farndone did in 1314, and they'd fail just as completely. By one common count, England alone saw more than 30 attempts to ban the game between 1314 and 1667. In the spring of 1314, Edward II was preparing to march an enormous army north into Scotland. The proclamation formed part of a wider effort to keep the peace in his capital while he was away. London's merchants had reportedly been complaining for some time about the noise and the unruly gatherings that came with the games. With the king and much of the realm's fighting strength about to head north to disaster, the last thing anyone wanted was a city full of large, excitable crowds chasing a ball. To grasp why anyone would treat a ball game as a public emergency, we have to forget everything the word football or soccer brings to mind. Medieval football had no referee and barely any rules that we would recognize today at the World Cup. It was a mass scramble between rival crowds, sometimes whole parishes or whole trades, with an unlimited number of players on each side. The ball that was used was often an inflated pig's bladder, sometimes wrapped in a leather casing to increase the durability. In the countryside, Shrovetide matches could run between neighboring villages, with the goal posts set miles apart, and the ball wrestled through streets. The earliest detailed account of ball games in London comes from William Fitzstephen, a clerk who'd served Thomas Becket and who wrote an affectionate description of the city in the 1170s. He describes how, after dinner on Shrove Tuesday, the youth of the city would pour out into the fields for the famous game of ball. Every school had its own ball, and so did every trade, and everyone got involved. The older men rode out on horseback to watch the young ones compete, and Fitzstephen claims the spectacle stirred up the watchers' own lost youth. Notably, he never calls the game football, and what he saw may have been tamer than what came later. But the basic picture is already there in the 12th century. Holidays, crowds, fields outside the walls, and a ball. What came later was considerably rougher, and legal records from the period sometimes treat football matches less like sport and more like criminal incidents. At Oldham in Northumberland in 1280, a player named Henry de Ellington reportedly perished during a game after running into another man's belt knife. In 1321, a priest named William de Spalding received a dispensation from Pope John the 22nd after a friend collided with him during a match. That man struck the sheathed knife at William's belt and passed away from the wound 6 days later. Nobody had drawn a weapon in either case, but the game itself, played at full speed by men carrying everyday blades, was dangerous enough on its own. Add in trampled stalls, broken windows, gambling, and the old grudges between neighborhoods that a match could reignite, and the merchants' complaints start to look reasonable. Notably, King Edward II, the man who was behind the ban, may in fact have been the first king to play football. This is speculation, but as discussed, Edward was the kind of man who shunned the company of nobles to enjoy time together with the common folk. Whether he actually played the game with his subjects hasn't been recorded, but given that he was digging ditches and doing other forms of rustic labor, it wouldn't be surprising. These were the exact sort of men who the history books record as being the early adopters of football. Whatever Londoners thought of the proclamation, they don't seem to have obeyed it for long. Records show that the game continued onwards, and people were prosecuted for playing it, generally in situations where games became highly unruly. City records from 1409 show that officials were trying to stop people from collecting money for the games. This suggests that the ban may have had the effect of turning football into something closer to what we would recognize at the World Cup today. The complaint that got football banned was largely the issue of the complete chaos these makeshift soccer games unleashed. It's speculated that the initial ban actually forced players to approach it in a more organized way. The 1409 attempt to ban funding games provides strong evidence for this, since it implies organized sport, rather than a few hundred guys kicking around a ball. Notably, in the intervening years, there were a number of other attempts to ban football, though these bans were less about unruliness and more about idleness. In 1349, Edward III, son of the king behind the first ban, ordered able-bodied men to give up football and practice archery instead, since the kingdom's defense rested on its bowmen. Richard II tried again in 1389, and Henry IV did the same in 1401, both doing so for reasons of national security. North of the border, the Scottish Parliament decreed in 1424 that no man should play football, on pain of a small fine. A later act of 1457 banned football and an early form of golf together for the same security reason. Henry VIII, who reportedly owned a pair of football boots made by his own royal shoemaker, attempted a ban of his own in the 1540s. By 1608, the authorities in Manchester were still complaining that disorderly persons kept smashing glass windows every year with their football. In the end, the game outlasted royal proclamations and magistrates alike, until, in the 19th century, they finally stopped fighting it and wrote rules for it instead. By that point, football and other forms of organized sport had come to be seen as the opposite of idleness and rowdiness. Instead, it was seen as instilling physical prowess, martial virtues, and a sense of competition in the young men who were busy conquering large portions of the world. Here's a question that has started more academic fistfights than almost anything else in early English history, and it sounds deceptively simple. When the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, how many of them actually showed up? Was it a flood of tens of thousands of farming families dragging their lives across the North Sea? Or was it a thin crust of warlords and their retinues, a few thousand men who took over the top of the social pyramid and let everyone else carry on speaking a slightly different language? The answer matters more than it seems, because it decides whether England was built on the bones of a replaced people or simply rebranded by their Germanic conquerors. And for 2 centuries, the smartest historians in the room couldn't agree on which it was, until modern science intervened to clear up the historical mystery. The trouble starts with the sources, because the people who lived nearest to these events weren't exactly running a census. Our earliest narrative comes from Gildas, a British cleric writing in scathing sermon-like prose probably around the middle of the 6th century. He tells us a proud and foolish British ruler invited Saxon warriors over to defend the island against raiders from the north. These mercenaries, once settled, complained their pay wasn't generous enough, then turned on their hosts with fire and fury. What Gildas never does is give anything approaching a ballpark estimate of how many Anglo-Saxons actually arrived. Roughly 200 years later, the monk Bede picked up that same story and tidied it into something far more orderly. Writing in 731, he identified 3 distinct peoples behind the migration: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. He pinned the arrival to a specific year, 449, under the command of 2 brothers who weren't yet given names. Bede also passed on a striking detail. The homeland of the Angles, he claimed, lay empty in his own day, deserted because so many had picked up and left. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, assembled from the 9th century onward, names those brothers as Hengist and Horsa. It has them land at Ebbsfleet in Kent, and provides an account of Horsa being slain at a battle around 455. It's a tidy narrative, and almost none of it can be trusted as straightforward historical reporting. Bede was writing nearly 3 centuries after the events, with an agenda about a unified English church, and the chronicle is later still. Bede, for his part, was working from older sources that haven't survived, but the fact was he was writing to prove that England was one people under one church. Even the label for the whole episode, "The Coming of the Saxons," was a phrase that later medieval chroniclers fastened onto, rather than anything the first witnesses used. We do get one outside voice who weighed in on the Anglo-Saxon migration, an Eastern Roman historian known as Procopius of Caesarea. He was a historian working in the Eastern Mediterranean in the mid-6th century, who mentioned, almost in passing, that after the Romans lost their grip on Britain around 411, demographics changed. He correctly notes they never got it back, and that the island was now home to Saxons, Angles, Frisians, and Britons living side by side. That's it. That's the contemporary paper trail for one of the largest cultural shifts in European history. So if the writers won't give us numbers, the temptation is to reverse engineer them, and this is where it gets properly difficult. Nobody knows how many people lived in Britain when the Romans left. A figure you'll often see is that the population had slumped to somewhere around 1 million by the 5th century, battered by the collapse of Roman administration. But that number itself is highly controversial, and some historians argue it stayed considerably higher. Against that uncertain backdrop, the estimates for how many newcomers arrived have swung wildly, and not by a little. At the low end, some archaeologists have argued for as few as 10 or 20,000 migrants over several generations, a trickle that rose to the top. At the high end, others have defended figures of 100 to 200,000 spread across roughly a century. Part of the reason the guesses vary so much is that you can't simply count graves and stop there. You also have to assume how fast the newcomers multiplied once they'd settled. A difference of 1% in the yearly birth rate, sustained across a century, throws the final total off by an enormous margin. One influential reconstruction leaned on a grim physical clue. Studying early Anglo-Saxon graves, a researcher noticed that men buried with weapons tended to be taller than men buried without them. This researcher read that height gap as a marker of two distinct populations sharing the same cemeteries. Under this theory, the Anglo-Saxon men who came to Britain were, by and large, the strongest fighting men the Germanic continental peoples had to offer. Men who weren't fit for combat were, in essence, left behind in what is now Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. The native Britons, on the other hand, didn't have a similar selection bias towards tall, powerful fighting men, because they didn't have an influx of powerful outsiders to help them. Build a model on that foundation, and you can argue for a substantial influx rather than a token one. A separate exercise crunched the logistics of moving men, and eventually their families, across the North Sea. It concluded that moving around 250,000 people from northwestern Germany to East Anglia was entirely feasible inside a few decades, with a modest fleet of boats. The point of that calculation wasn't that it definitely happened. It was that the sheer scale people had once dismissed as impossible turned out to be perfectly doable. Then there's the strangest piece of evidence of all, and it's one you can still hear today. When the Anglo-Saxons settled, the language of Roman and pre-Roman Britain almost vanished from the eastern lowlands. Old English absorbed remarkably few words from the Brittonic tongue spoken by the existing population, and the map filled up with Germanic place names. The older Celtic names survived mainly out in the west of the country. For a long time, that linguistic wipeout was treated as evidence of a complete replacement of the native population by the Germanic settlers. Surely a language only dies that completely, scholars reasoned, when the people speaking it have largely been swept aside. But here's the thing, and it's the crack that split the whole field open. Languages don't actually need a massacre to disappear. History is littered with cases where a small, dominant group imposed its speech on a much larger population that simply switched over within a few generations. This was much more common in societies where people didn't have a tradition of writing. For instance, when the old Prussians were conquered by the Teutonic Knights, within a few generations, most of them were speaking German and thought of themselves as Germans. If a confident Old English-speaking elite controlled land, law, and status, the locals had every incentive to adopt their language and very little to record their own. The near-total triumph of English, in other words, could point to a tidal wave of settlers, or it could point to a small ruling class whose prestige did the heavy lifting. The same fact supports two opposite stories, which is exactly why nobody could close the argument. By the late 20th century, the debate had hardened into two camps. The traditional view, sometimes called the migrationist position, took the old chronicles roughly at their word and pictured large numbers of Germanic settlers displacing or absorbing the Britons. The Challenger view, which gathered real momentum from the 1970s, argued that the initial arrivals were a small warrior elite, offering an attractive new social order. Most of the people living in lowland Britain were natives who gradually became culturally Anglo-Saxon. Change the burial customs and the language, add in some intermarriage, and you've changed the culture without needing to move many settlers. It was an elegant idea, and for a couple of decades it carried the day, with the old view thought of as incorrect and perhaps a bit outdated. The Anglo-Saxon migration had been reframed as something more similar to the Norman conquest. The Normans replaced the Anglo-Saxon elite almost completely, but at the end of the day, this was just a replacement of the absolute upper crust of society. Around the turn of the millennium, a study of the Y chromosome, the slice of DNA passed straight down on the male line, changed the picture. It compared men from a band of Central English towns with samples from Wales and from the Frisian coast of the continent. The English samples looked startlingly continental, close enough to the North Sea populations that the researchers suggested a mass migration with a very large male contribution. That seemed to hand the wind straight back to the migrationists, but the numbers were so lopsided, though, that they created a fresh puzzle. If half or more of the male lineages in England were continental, but the archaeology suggested a modest number of actual settlers, how did so few newcomers change the genetic makeup so much? A 2006 model suggested that a relatively small Anglo-Saxon group, holding social and economic advantages, could have completely changed the genetic makeup of England. The model stated they could have out-reproduced the locals to the point where Germanic male lineages dominated the gene pool within roughly 15 generations. Critics pushed back hard, pointing out that the Y chromosome data could be explained without imagining anything so rigid. Meanwhile, a popular account published the same year swung the other way entirely, arguing that most British ancestry was far older than the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon migration was, it was argued, a minor event that had relatively little genetic impact. The deadlock only began to break when researchers stopped guessing from living people and started reading the genomes of the dead. An early breakthrough sequenced a small group of ancient individuals dug up near Cambridge, spanning the Iron Age through the Anglo-Saxon period. It used them to estimate that people in eastern England today carry, on average, around 38% of their ancestry from the Anglo-Saxon incomers. Crucially, those ancient migrants looked genetically closest to modern Dutch, northwestern German, and Danish populations, exactly where the old sources pointed. The decisive study landed a few years later, and its scale dwarfed everything before it. Researchers analyzed several hundred ancient genomes, including 278 individuals from England, set against thousands of comparison samples. In early medieval eastern and southern England, roughly 75% of the ancestry came from communities across the North Sea. But the same data demolished the idea of a clean replacement just as firmly, and the newcomers mixed with the locals, and they did it differently from place to place. At a cemetery near Dover, the team reconstructed a family tree across 4 generations and caught the exact moment migrant and native lines married into each other. At a Sussex site, by contrast, people of settler and local ancestry seem to have been buried apart, hinting at some social distance. The grave goods told their own subtle story of class differences in Anglo-Saxon England. Women of Anglo-Saxon descent were more often buried with brooches and beads, while weapons turned up at a slightly higher frequency amongst Anglo-Saxon men. All that brings us back to the central question, the historical mystery that we started with. The number of Anglo-Saxon migrants was almost certainly large enough to make up 3/4 of the gene pool in the early medieval East. This puts the older estimates of a couple 100,000 newcomers comfortably back in play, and potentially even understates them. The elegant theory of a tiny conquering elite, the one that ruled the universities for a generation or two, hasn't survived contact with the ancient DNA. And yet the migrationists don't get a clean victory either, because the settlers didn't actually wipe anyone out. They married into the existing population and farmed alongside it, leaving today's English with a deep continental inheritance laid over an older island ancestry. The honest answer to how many Anglo-Saxons came is that we still can't give a single confident figure, but the floor keeps rising. The picture that's emerging is neither a gentle takeover nor a clean conquest. It's a migration big enough to reshape a population and complex enough to leave the English people with one foot on each shore.